Hi guys, this is Apple Trees. We have a very special episode today. Well, probably as always, we will talk about the things and places where you can put Swift, and those will not be Apple devices, or not just Apple devices, let's say it that way. Arina, Max, hi.
Hi everyone.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead. Yeah. Let's start with some introduction. So we have Max Desiatov, who is one of the authors of Swift WebAssembly and TokamakUI. But before we dive into that, let's start with some background. Max, could you share a bit how you get into the development, how you got into Swift WebAssembly and, well, Swift for everything, I would say.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. In terms of the history of all these things, I started programming in general with, I would say, somehow I stumbled upon in the Structure Interpretation of Computer Programs book, which is focused on Lisp and functional programming. That's how I would say my main kind of experience of coding was based on that book. I was inspired by it, and before I started building any kind of commercial projects, that was kind of it had a pretty high impact on my programming background. And after that, as soon as I started building something commercial, that was in programming language Haskell, which is not to be confused with Pascal, but Haskell is a functional programming language with which I've built some kind of simple systems, mostly backend with bits of front end as well. But that was a small freelance project, and when I went further in my career, I understood that FP was and especially Haskell were considered to be like academic at that time, which was 2008, 2009. And by 2010, I landed at a job where I was mostly doing C++ and JavaScript with cross-platform stuff, and that's how I got introduced to macOS and Apple platforms in general. iPhone has just started then, and Objective-C gained traction as well, especially because of iPhone and App Store. I transitioned into Objective-C developer at around 2012 and developed apps for macOS, iPad, iPhone at that time. Worked on an indie app at that time, not my own app, but an app by other people. It was still a time where indie apps could become very successful, and let's say founder of such indie apps could employ a couple of people working on such apps. And I had some experience with JavaScript as well. Node.js became a thing. And by 2014 that's when Swift became announced. I also had my own app by that time that I published on the App Store, or it was going to publish, which was written completely in Objective-C. With all of this FP background, it wasn't really, and C++ and JavaScript, I wasn't really satisfied with how Objective-C looked like, and especially compared to JavaScript. I still think I understand how Objective-C looks like it looks, as it's essentially a layer on top of C, but it still lacked a lot of the advanced features that other languages had. And when Swift came out, it was basically a revelation for me. It's like, yeah, these folks do get it. They do get what FP is, even though Swift wasn't advertised like a functional programming language. I think it's one of the approaches to how FP was kind of commercialized in some sense, and quite widely. especially the Swift standard library itself is built on functional programming principles like immutability and free functions and stuff like that. Functional reactive programming became more popular with Combine. So at that point, yeah, Swift made perfect sense for me. I rewrote that up basically with first Swift betas in a couple weeks, months, however much that took with all of the compiler crashes, Xcode crashes. But I managed to submit something to the App Store of my own that was written in Swift. And from that point, I think most of the time I was focused on Swift. I had some digressions with for example, I was had a startup idea in NLP space where I was trying to use Python, and it was pretty interesting experience with how Python evolved during all those years, Node.js as well. But Swift was still there for me, and I had some consulting experience too. I think some of that could explain how I became more interested in porting Swift to other platforms. I stumbled upon a couple of people who approached me and asked whether I could develop an app for them, and usually they ask for a quote, an estimate, how long that's going to take. Can you add support for Android or a web app, especially? And when you basically tell them, yeah, iOS app is going to be in Swift because that makes perfect sense. You'll get the most advanced features if you want them, and even if you don't, accessibility, for example, matters. And basic things like animations, whether the UI looks like a native UI, do matter. And because of that, iOS app is written in Swift, Android app is probably written in Kotlin or Java, and it's basically 3 different apps. And so for clients who compare that and say, yeah, we don't care about any of the advanced stuff, we don't have any budget for maintaining 3 separate code bases. So I became frustrated with that. I would say I lost a few prospective clients because of it, because they basically have chosen, no, we can't afford maintaining 3 separate code bases. We want to share code as much as possible. And with React Native gaining traction, especially Kotlin multi-platform as well, I understood that Swift is not a very kind of favorable position. And so it made sense to start digging into having Swift supported in some sense on other platforms. And even though a lot of people already worked on something like that, for example, Swift on the web, there were a few projects that were trying to explore that area, Serverside Swift as well. And I think I found some kind of niche there and started digging into that.
Nice.
Okay, thank you for sharing your story. And to tell the truth, I understand your inspiration with Swift after Objective-C, because I had some Ruby on Rails and JavaScript background as well. And the main pain point was sharing between platforms for you, but you spread it everywhere you can, as I see. And what's the state for Serverside Swift at the moment?
That's a good question. So I personally, I would say I'm not focused on Serverside Swift for the last few years. When soon as Swift became open source and was announced as something that you could run on Linux, I remember I would say it would be justified to say there was some amount of hype to it. One of the startup ideas that I've considered at the time was related to Serverside Swift. It was also maintaining a newsletter about Serverside Swift. At that period, 2016, 17, I would say, maybe 2018 is when I saw there were tutorials published every week, some small libraries and people trying this and that, and that's when there were 3 competing Serverside Swift frameworks, at least the biggest ones like Zevo and Vapor, Perfect. Oh, there was Kitura from IBM, and now we see all of that basically died down. I'm glad that Vapor is still going, and Vapor maintainers are doing a great job. And I think it's hard to say whether it became better. In a sense, there is not as much probably unjustified hype in some sense. And also we see now that one explanation to this could be that some more advanced stuff, like if you want to build a more advanced backend with Kubernetes and replication and AWS and all of that stuff, it only becomes available now in the recent years. And all of this more serious stuff still has to compete with more established players in this area, like Go and Node.js and Scala. And so there are kind of two approaches here. One is to teach iOS developers, which is like the biggest niche for Swift devs right now. Yeah. Those people need to gain experience in all of these more advanced topics like AWS and all of those services, or say Azure or Google Cloud Platform, like deployments, blue-green deployment, roll-in deployments, Kubernetes, all that stuff. And that's very hard. It's like a completely different niche, because we iOS devs, we spend years on like kind of polishing, focusing on animations and all the different ways to build a collection view. And there is just as much as the amount of knowledge needed to do like successful big scale server-side projects is just as big. So Swift there is in this kind of interesting niche, because it's either you convert iOS devs and they learn all of this stuff from scratch, or you compete with other people. So people who write stuff in Go and Scala and Node.js have to see, oh, Swift is an interesting language because A, B, and C, and then we'd be able to capture this so-called market share in this area. And then people could convert from Swift who already have all that knowledge in large-scale deployments. I think concurrency Swift is a big thing here. So with Swift 5.5, we could say actors. It's probably Swift is one of the first like kind of commercial languages that has actors as first-class entities in the language itself, and that's amazing. The work that was done there by the Swift team is just it's outstanding, I would say. Well, compared to what I saw in other languages in this area. So I think that this is one of the kind of potential. I don't want to say it's a killer feature, but it could be a compelling thing where people who use other languages could say, "Oh, that's interesting. I would have a look at Swift." But it's just one part of the story. There's still developer tools and integration libraries that's probably still need some development, I would say.
So actors, how do you think? What is more important here, like a wide library, like to connect and connectors to database and abilities that will provide it, or this human factor? What stops more?
It's probably chicken and egg problem. I don't know. I'm not a. I wouldn't say that Serverside Swift again is my kind of focus, especially in my consulting experience. So I mostly build like front-end apps, and I've been just dabbling with kind of small-ish deployments with kind of where just one host and one database. So for me personally, developer tools is a big thing. Like Xcode does not support it. For Xcode, no non-Apple platforms just don't exist. And for other editors and IDEs like Visual Studio Code, for example, the support is just not as good, I would say. And so for me personally, developer tools is a big thing. But on the other hand, if there were like all other things where just there was some like amazing library that would make creation of backends in Swift would make it so easy that just the dev tools aren't as a big deal, aren't as a big problem. And still, people could still be compelled with all their libraries, and they would start building dev tools. So, but again, I'm just hypothesizing here. I don't know what the actual thinking of people who consider Swift, especially for large-scale projects, because that's where I think things happen. Like if someone inside, so that it just recalled that there is a server-side framework from Amazon called Smoke. So I have if there's some kind of origin story there where how do those people think who write that framework and who use it in production? As far as I know, it is used at Amazon in some capacity. Maybe they could share that. And me as having the limited experience here, I can only hypothesize what's there. But yeah, it's probably a chicken and egg problem in a sense.
It seems that actors are actually, well, that's not my opinion, not just my opinion, but there are a lot of talks that actors are added to Swift not just for the iOS or macOS. It has some like usage there specifically for the like routing everything to main thread, but it looks like a feature for server side or like backend apps or something like that, at least like from some perspective. We also have a comment now that Swift is not needed on the backend. I don't know. I probably would want to have Swift on the backend and like have, well, currently if you talk full stack is like usually JavaScript, right? And like full stack developer, like JavaScript developer. If we can call full stack Swift developer, probably that would be interesting. I mean, at least there will be a competition, and both languages will evolve from that. Yeah. So speaking of JavaScript, web, and Swift, so we know you as one of the, well, will be proper to call you as the maintainer of Swift WebAssembly. So what's that?
Yeah, in one sentence, Swift for WebAssembly is a fork of the Swift toolchain that adds support for the WebAssembly target. And WebAssembly itself is a virtual machine that's available in every browser, which makes things like that possible, which allows you to compile all the different languages, including Swift, and run them in the browser. The main motivation there, again, as I said, like I want to have some possibility to share code. It probably all started with an issue in the mscripten repository. Mscripten is a compiler for C and C++, LLVM-based languages to WebAssembly, and originally ASM.js as well. Basically, ASM.js was a precursor project to WebAssembly. And someone back in 2014, the same year the Swift was announced, we already knew the Swift is based on LLVM. And people just started dabbling with, like, can we get mscripten and Swift compiler and just chuck them somehow together, get LLVM intermediate representation, feed that to mscripten, and get some Swift code running in the browser. And it was a huge thread. It had like dozens and dozens of comments. I think I tried in 2018 playing with some of the patches that were flying around in that thread, where people started sharing their forks, and they were trying to get to push things forward with that implementation. Swift by that time was open source, which was already a great boost in that direction. There are still a lot of things that got in the way, like Objective-C interoperability, multi-threading, the way reference counting is implemented. So this is one of the reasons that languages such as Rust and C and C++ got WebAssembly support much earlier, because memory management there is much simpler. And yeah, for Swift, it took a lot of time. There are some features in the standard library, like advanced string support with Unicode that was also hard to implement. Long story short, me and a couple of co-maintainers, I would say actually my role in the Swift WebAssembly is not as major. I'm hesitate to say how many % of the work I've done, but I've been mostly doing let's say, kind of CI setup and submitting patches upstream to Apple's repository and resolving conflicts with the upstream stuff. Two people made like very significant contributions. So Zhou Zhang in 2018, 2019, he was working, basically getting all of these things to the, not to the finish line, but to something that was demoable. So SwiftWasm, the name of the project, was basically established by him, and he created a GitHub organization. And I was just polishing all that stuff when Zhou Wei switched to other projects. And later, 2019, 2020 is when Yuta Saito from Japan has joined our project, and he is a fantastic engineer, and he has a ton of knowledge on how the Swift toolchain works and how WebAssembly implementations work. He has written a WebAssembly debugger and interpreter in Rust, which was a tremendous help for us when porting the foundation library. And long story short, we got there. We've released Swift 5.4, I think. Sorry, Swift 5.3 last year, and that's how we started basically getting some kind of working things in the browser. Yuta was also the main author of the JavaScript Git library, which allows you to call from Swift into JavaScript and interact with things in the browser. But also, there are different applications here. So you could, for example, compile a Swift with SwiftWasm. You could get a WebAssembly binary and run it with Node.js, for example, or an AWS Lambda. And wherever JavaScript is available, or better to say WebAssembly virtual machine is available, which is every browser, Node.js, and some other JavaScript runtimes. You may include this. And there are also standalone WebAssembly machines for like IoT, and there's all the crazy stuff going on in blockchain with WebAssembly that I just don't want to. I'm personally not a fan of any of the blockchain, but I don't want to start any flame wars based on that. I would just say I'm not interested in that stuff, but I know some of those things are going on there, and there are a lot of people interested in that as well.
So for you, was main motivation is to share code and like a final goal at Tokamak. And but it's nice that you noticed this case with blockchain. I was really thinking, what tasks we can pass to WebAssembly, maybe some machine learning or something like this. You already shared us some of achievements, and what you can say about Tokamak achievements? What some JavaScript and functionality coverage? Is there a goal to cover everything it's possible to do with JavaScript and CSS?
And let's start with just what the Tokamak is.
Sure. So Tokamak started even before Swift UI was announced. By that time, UIKit, I already had some experience with React and was quite inspired by how easy it was to build declarative UIs with React, and especially, again, for any platforms. As I said, when a client comes to you and says, no, we can't afford maintaining three separate code bases, we're going to go with, say, React Native. At least I had to pay some attention to that and understand how all these things work. And React was really kind of having what we had at the point 2018 before Swift UI was announced in UIKit and UpKit. Yeah, that wasn't great compared to React, I would say. And it's a bit funny because people back then was, and I know that there's a general stereotype in Swift and iOS community like JavaScript. Whoa, that's not a good language, and React, it's browser stuff. But I hold on for a second. Just the basic principles there of declarative UI are still there. Like Swift UI is very similar to React. Swift UI is much more similar to React than UIKit and AppKit is. And the basic principles are still there. So Tokamak started as a library which basically ported React to React API to Swift on iOS and macOS. So the goal is that you write this kind of React-ish code in Swift, and you're able to share your code between macOS and iOS, and that's declarative code, which was, I think Catalyst was still there. I'm not sure if Catalyst is 2017, 2018, but basically SwiftUI was announced. It Sherlocked the whole idea, and by that point I was already working on Swift WebAssembly. It made sense to start to reorient Tokamak to target WebAssembly as a platform, and also a lot of the architectural things, because there's so much, a lot of common between React and SwiftUI in terms of architecture, in terms of how they work under the hood. It was enough to just change the top layer, the syntax of Tokamak to support SwiftUI, and by that point already alternative implementations appeared, like Swift Web UI, OpenSwiftUI, where people started reverse engineering SwiftUI to see how that works, and how you could make it work on other platforms as well. WebAssembly was my thing at that point. Nothing targeted WebAssembly, and so yeah. At some point, a couple of maintainers joined, which made things a lot easier, and some advancements in Swift WebAssembly as well. The main goal, I would say, is to cover as much SwiftUI API as possible, and ideally, if you have a SwiftUI app that does not have any platform-specific stuff like UIKit or AppKit, we want you to be able to just recompile a project with SwiftWasm and get this app running in the browser. Maybe some adjustments would be needed, but it's the same thing. I think Apple invented here a good term, which is not cross-platform, but multi-platform. So I think Tokamak is just a multi-platform. It's a SwiftUI backend for other platforms, potentially not just WebAssembly, but say Windows or maybe even Android in the future, because of how modular React architecture is. It allows you to maintain this high level of SwiftUI syntax and low level of renderers for each platform. Yeah, I don't know when we'll achieve that goal. And it's obviously a moving target with Apple announcing more and more SwiftUI stuff every year. But we are getting there, and there is a ton of stuff on our roadmap. So, but the goal is clear. It's a move and go, but we'd like to get there at some point. Maybe we'll chase and catch up with Apple at some point, and could declare Tokamak 1.0 fully compatible with SwiftUI. So 8 months later, WWDC breaks everything.
And actually, they didn't touch you still? Did you have some contacts?
From Apple, you mean?
Yeah.
Not with regards to Tokamak, and especially I would like to clarify that none of this is affiliated with Apple. This is just purely open source project. We work on it in our spare time. We don't reuse that. Tokamak is not it's basically an implementation of SwiftUI API. And what makes a lot of things easier, by the way, is the ruling. Just a little digression here, but there was a lawsuit between Oracle and Google about reuse between. The subject matter was basically is whether you can re-implement an API on different platform, or whether you can re-implement an API at all. And the Oracle's case was that APIs are copyrightable, and every re-implementation of an API is copyright infringement, which was basically, if there was a rule in there that Oracle is right, that would mean Tokamak or any kind of re-implementation of any API infringes copyright of the original author. That would be No, I don't want to imagine what would happen. Thankfully, the ruling was in favor of Google, which means that you can legally, you are allowed to take any API, re-implement it from scratch, as long as you don't, as long as you don't infringe on any other copyright matters, like you don't copy proprietary code. And that's what we do. We just have a look at the API, the function signatures, and try to understand how it actually works. So folks from Apple, I think in terms of supporting different platforms, I think it's not in their priority at all. It's not a business priority for them. So I saw some. Yeah, I didn't see any kind of actionable. I would say I didn't see any activity on the front of Tokamak. Swift WASM, there were a couple of like explicit endorsements from like people saying, "Oh, this is great. How can we help?" We started submitting patches to the main Swift repository, and we get reviews from those patches. But yeah, my understanding is that it's just support for other platforms that's not high on their list. Even Linux, and as we talked about server-side stuff, like maybe there are a couple of people working there on supporting Linux, but I have no idea what's going on there, but I have an impression there from the outside that like it's not a priority for them, unfortunately. And so we have to do everything ourselves. But on the other hand, it gives us like kind of complete freedom, and I believe in the power of like open source and collaboration, and how it opens the project to everyone, and we can develop everything in the open. So that's a nice bonus.
Before we continue, we also have one more comment regarding the Swift on server-side Swift. And that's like WebSocket support, data model generation. I would like to postpone this question till our next episode, where we will be talking about Swift, server-side Swift specifically. And that will be like small announcement in advance, but we will be talking about Vapor, and we will have a guest who will be able to answer those questions specifically and with more details. So please stay tuned. In 2 weeks, we will be talking about just about that. And Max, my question to you, so you do a lot of projects, and like you also work somewhere, and open sources, probably there are some donations or everything, but still this is something additional. How do you keep up? Yep, you're on mute.
Yeah, the plague of lockdowns, and of course I'm muted at this point. Okay, so with keeping up, I don't think I'm keeping up well. There is obviously this kind of shiny thing syndrome, so I do get excited about any new idea, technology, and I hope I have somewhat manageable amount of projects that I'm working on. So speaking of COVID as well, the main progress of Tokamak and Swift UI, Tokamak and Swift WASM happened in 2020. So as soon as COVID started, I think the amount of funding on a lot of projects, a lot of startups and consulting work dried down. I was focusing basically February 2020. I started focusing on open source work full time. Any kind of side projects that I had where I was helping out people, that completely dried up because of lack of funding, because like market was completely frozen. So basically for most of 2020, I was working on all of the open source stuff almost full time. And this year I'm back to doing mostly consulting work. So unfortunately, the speed of development on the open source stuff has slowed down at least on my side. But I'm really happy that we managed during the last year. We managed to get a lot of contributors, even co-maintainers. A lot of people joined and contribute and are interested in the project, and what keeps us going. A couple of sponsors joined as well. So as soon as I wish we had enough sponsorships and donations that will allow us to work full time. If not me, some other sponsors, and maybe I myself would love to return to working on open source full time, or at least in a much bigger way that I'm working on it right now. But yeah, I don't think there is any kind of magic here. There was a period of time where I worked on it full time in the last year. And sometimes I regret that I start so many projects, because I have a couple of open source libraries where people come and ask for help or submit pull requests. And I apologize that I may be slow in reviewing some of those pull requests, but still, yeah, we're getting there. And I myself, I had a few more projects in the back of my mind for Serverside Swift as well. And I'm just holding my hand and just saying, no, don't do it yet until you're fully sure that you either find partners and maintainers who could help or enough contributors. But yeah, we'll see. I think there is no magic here. Anyone could, assuming, and of course I'm privileged enough that I had enough kind of savings to get me through the last year and worked on all of these open source projects. I know a lot of people, there's a lot of talking about you should contribute to open source and your GitHub table should be all green squares. And but I understand there are a lot of people that there's just 8 hours of a full-time job is enough. Yeah. A lot of time you're exhausted. So if I'm talking about all of this exciting stuff, but if you think, I should contribute, but I don't have enough time. Yeah, I don't have enough time for contributing as well. Don't be discouraged by that. And not everyone has to contribute, but if you're interested, it's obviously a great approach to learning and collaborating in the open and getting and it's a lot of fun as well. Maybe not for everyone, and I understand that there may be some limitations in terms of time. That's somehow I manage, but not as much as I'd like.
And is it enough excitement for you to put in a roadmap Swift UI concurrency support?
Yeah, that's very exciting. We do have some limited support in JavaScript Kit for async await. Actors not there yet, and I think there's a whole different topic of multi-threading support in WebAssembly and in the browsers. So I think actors are most useful when you have multiple threads. For SwiftWasm and the future SwiftWasm releases, I think until multi-threading is supported in WebAssembly in all browsers, and unfortunately Safari is the slowest here, so probably until all browsers support this, it's not very wise for us to add to basically embed this, because we don't want to produce any code that's not compatible with Safari, for example. It would work on all browsers except Safari. So probably whatever we do on the matter of actors, it probably would be just like a shim. So whatever actors you create, they would all run on the main thread, the only thread that is there in the browser. And in terms of async await, it should just work. It already works in some prototype code. And when interacting, our main goal is to make it very smooth to interact with JavaScript. So if there is an async JavaScript function and you call into that one, it's just a plain async function on the Swift side. And just to follow up quickly on the WebSocket support question, yeah, everything that's possible with JavaScript is also possible with SwiftWasm. We may not have a specific dedicated library that provides statically typed bindings in Swift, but you can still call any JavaScript stuff from Swift with this JavaScript Git library. It's just going to bridge any kind of calls and data between JavaScript world and Swift world. And so WebSockets are supported in JavaScript. Yeah, sure, you can write Swift code that does essentially the same thing. And we do want to make that interaction as smooth as possible, especially with async await.
Okay. So you mentioned that you've built a contribution community. So there are other contributors to both projects. Let's imagine we have a listener or viewer who wants to start contributing there. What skills, what tools, what languages these contributors should know? How to start? I mean, what?
I think, yeah, if you're excited about the project, just first of all, probably best to join our Discord channel, which is the SwiftWasm channel. You should be able to. You can find a link to it from swiftwasm.org. That would help you a lot of the way. Like any questions you have, there are me and other maintainers there who can help you answer questions. If you worked with these projects before, so first of all, have some kind of goal in mind. What would you like to actually do? And even simple things are very useful, like improving documentation, fixing bugs, just plain kind of housekeeping. Like if you see an issue and you know an answer to that issue, you can say, oh, here's a solution, or this issue is a duplicate. Any help of that matter would be appreciated. I think in terms of platforms, skills, languages, if you're a Swift dev, that's great. If you have JavaScript knowledge, that's even better, but not required. It would help with some more advanced use cases, though. Unfortunately, we don't support Windows yet, but I hope at some point in the future we would like to provide a tool chain which you can install on Windows and compile WebAssembly binaries there on Windows directly. So it's either Mac or Linux at this point. We do have some documentation, but if you see anything there that's lacking, just ping us, let us know. As far as I know, there's some of the feedback that I heard is getting started is very easy. You just install one package from Homebrew, and it does everything for you. It compiles and downloads the tool chain and starts the project, refreshes the browser window, does all of this kind of basic setup for you automatically. And so I hope you don't stumble upon any issues with that. But again, if you do, let us know. Even given feedback of that matter, of that nature, is very helpful. And in terms of more advanced stuff, of course, if you have knowledge of the Swift toolchain, that's just that'll be amazing. One of the big problems we have is keeping our fork up to date with the upstream Swift. So that's a big thing on the roadmap that we'd like to resolve. So if you can help us with that, that would be fantastic. But that's a more advanced thing, and if you're not interested in that, I know Swift toolchain is not for the faint of heart. So just doing all of the kind of simpler things, and JavaScript Git library is also needs some contributions. Tokamak as well is an interesting area, and you could learn a lot about how Swift UI works under the hood if you contribute there. So I think, yeah, there are enough projects there to contribute for all levels of skills, whether you're a beginner or more advanced, where you're just getting started, or you have some kind of app built already and you stumbled upon any bug. Everything is on our GitHub. Discord is like a main channel of communication. Xcode may help in terms of syntax highlighting, but we also have a guide how to get started with Visual Studio Code. Yeah, some basic command line terminal knowledge may be needed if you contribute to more advanced stuff. But again, if you just can type 2 commands, copy paste them from our guide, that should be enough.
Awesome. I hope there will be more contributors there. For like my personal hope here is that the project will advance. And I have friends who are like pointing to the Flutter, which is like spreading from mobile to other platforms, to the web, to desktops. And I really want to see SwiftUI as a competitor, as a competition there. And like not just SwiftUI, but the TokamakUI looks like the very promising project which might take that to other platforms. We are actually running out of time, but before we wrap up, we have one question from our team, and we know that you are a little bit into retro gaming. Is that true, first of all?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I'm mostly dabbling with some old PC titles from 90s and aughts. I'm afraid to say I have like 100 titles bought on GOG on a good old games store. No idea when I'll have time to play any of those. And yeah, so the answer is yes.
The lightning question will be like, what's your favorite game? And do you have any plans on like redoing some of the games, like, I don't know, like in an open source manner on the modern technologies, like just for fun?
So just one favorite, it's a really hard question. It's I'm just in the corner here and I don't know how to answer that. So yeah, just classic PC stuff, Fallout 1 and 2, Diablo as well. Heroes of Might and Magic is just it's an obvious classic. Disciples, just these kind of 4 or 5 games. That's what I've spent a lot of time with recently. Just playing them on my old MacBook is now converted to a Windows gaming laptop thanks to Boot Camp and Intel CPU inside of that. And in terms of recreating some of these games, I don't know if I'd be able to do any of that from scratch, but I know there is a great kind of niche of open source game engine recreation. So, for example, Diablo 1 was faithfully recreated in C, where people, the source code is available on GitHub. They were even able to recreate it like in a binary compatible way, so that you can swap the binary and compile from those sources. It would be exactly the same. That's fascinating thing. I contributed to macOS support of that port of Diablo, but recreating something from scratch, that's too hard of a thing. I know there are some ports of Fallout on GitHub. I could submit a few patches here and there, but maybe I'll get to finishing any of those ports at some point in the future.
That would be nice. I mean, like, yeah, old Fallouts, like first 2 probably, like personal opinion, like something to try play a game, like something like that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. That was a really, really interesting talk, and we wish the projects to succeed and like gain more traction and more contribution and more sponsors as well. For all our listeners and viewers, we will see you in 2 weeks, and as we said, there will be a talk on Serverside Swift. So we're continuing our topic on like where you can go with Swift. Okay, that's probably it. Max, again, thank you very much, and
thank you for coming and sharing all the. Bye.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
See ya.